So thank you again to everybody for joining this talk today. I'm going to start off by doing a brief introduction of our speakers. Sorry, give me one moment. So to my left, first we have Alaa, who is a CUPE steward and Spring member based in Toronto. Let's give Alaa a little welcome. Next is Octavio, who is an arts worker and a steward in OPSU. Again, quick clap for Octavio. And lastly, Elizabeth is an illustrator from Scotland, now also a Spring member based in Toronto. Whew. All right. So before I hand it over to our speakers, I'm just going to explain generally how this meeting will work. So the speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes. Then we'll have questions and comments from the audience. And at the end, the speakers will respond to your questions and comments in their concluding remarks. Sorry. If you would like to speak during the discussion, please raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list at that time. As a heads up, we'll be using an equity speakers list, so I may not end up calling folks in the order they raise their hands, but we will prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. And yeah, we'll go over this again when the discussion comes, but for now, I'm going to hand it over to the speakers.
Thank you, Al, for the introduction. Yeah, basically this talk is going to look at three core questions. First, what is consciousness and why does it matter? Two, what ideas do we have and where do they come from? And three, how do these ideas change? So I'm going to start off with the question, what is consciousness and why does it matter? Consciousness is simply the act of becoming aware, for example, waking up from sleep or unconsciousness, or being aware of oneself. A person can be conscious and be conscious of many things. They can be aware that they are a person, and for example, that they are a person who is a part of a community with others. Class consciousness is becoming aware that you are in community or share an identity with others on the basis of class. It's important to note here, what is class? The dictionary describes class as a group sharing the same economic or social status, and generally people might agree that the class you're in is dependent on the money you make. St. Louis NPR interviewed a bunch of people, and that was generally the consensus. Others might argue that it's the disposable income you have, your education, if you own your own home, or the cultural content you consume. It's sometimes difficult to find community, and I define community here as a group of people in a shared place with shared ideas or interests, or who are working towards similar goals around class, because class feels so subjective. There's no one common understanding and absolute of what working class or middle class means. People may feel more or less in one class, then move to a different part of the city or country and feel another, or people may feel like the class they associate with fluctuates depending on their circumstances. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx defined the working class as a class of laborers who only live so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. Engels also described the proletariat as the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. These definitions might not resonate with everybody now. Only 20% of Canada's population today works in agriculture or industry. In Marx's day, this was 90%. Some people in the working and middle classes are not paid any wage at all. For example, stay-at-home parents, people who are unable to work, etc. I would argue that the middle class doesn't exist, but I recognize different income levels within the working class. I would also, however, agree with Marx and Engels' definition of working class. Ultimately, as people who are not in the ruling class, our labor, lives, or other output is exploited. I would define exploitation here as using the work of another to benefit yourself. Work here can also be defined as anything you put out in the world, whether it's paid for or not. This is an objective and somewhat measurable definition of class. Some people who are paid well with good holidays, benefits, and other perks maybe in more comfortable positions than those living in poverty. But ultimately, if your output produces more value than you receive, you're still an exploited worker. But many people who work to survive or to afford basic necessities don't see themselves as workers at all. They might more immediately relate to the 2S LGBTQIA+ community as an artist, a teacher, or a middle manager. It's hard to promote class consciousness to a wider population who don't see themselves as a single class or even workers at all. This disconnection is an example of a contradiction in our consciousness. We can both believe that there is a ruling class that has immense power and specifically has power over a lot of the things that we do, at the same time as believing that we are not members of the class that the ruling class oppresses. A 2023 survey from a conservative think tank found that in Canada, 42% of the population favored socialism. At that time, apparently 25% would even pay more taxes to make it happen, including 72% of the population strongly agreeing that Canada should create a new wealth tax on the top 1% of high-income citizens. Time and time again, wealth taxes, affordable or free healthcare, free education, and affordable housing proved to be popular ideas no matter what political class or political party people belong to. So socialist ideas are really popular, but why don't people see themselves as socialists or even members of the working class? Generally, people don't want to be oppressed. People don't want to see themselves as being oppressed, even if ultimately they agree that something is very wrong with the world. So why does it matter if people have class consciousness or not? As I recently saw Fred T. Joseph put into words, social media has made too many people believe that awareness is action. But if you aren't changing how you spend, who you support, or what you build in the real world, then you're just commenting and theorizing. Basically, we need to back up our ideas with action. To prepare for this talk, I also listened to Leah Petty speak about revolutionary consciousness as it relates to class consciousness. This is becoming aware that not only are you part of a class, but that you can take action to bring change to your class. I don't think that you need class consciousness specifically to have revolutionary consciousness, but you do need to have some consciousness and the awareness that you're part of something bigger than just yourself in order to do anything. Another way of looking at it is class consciousness is the realization that our issues are systemic, as Lady Idahar highlighted in a recent video on Instagram. People can become conscious and involved in organizing to elevate their consciousness in many different ways. And I define organizing here as working with others to actively make moves to make change happen and helping others to do so too. Unions are one way, but only 30% of workers are unionized, and not all who are unionized are actively involved in organizing. A meme going around at the moment is what radicalized you, and often includes people giving examples of their religious upbringing or just caring about other people in the face of a genocide. But it's good to think, what did radicalize you? What made you see yourself in relation to the society and economy that we live in? When I was younger, my mum boycotted Nestle, though she might have not have even called it boycotting. Later, I disagreed with George W. Bush, Tony Blair in the UK waging war in Iraq. These aren't inherently related, but they are the beginning of how I personally developed consciousness and how my personal political and sociological ideas were formed, which Ala's going to speak to next, but not about me personally. I wouldn't call my parents radical, but they've been involved in organizing for a long time, helping to run the community council in their small part of a city in northeast Scotland, what they call the dog shit council, because so much of their time is spent dealing with dog shit in children's parks. Common ground and community can be found in many different places, from dog shit to building homes, from access to green space to fighting to end a genocide, or complicity in a genocide. Solidarity can also be built, and organizing can start by stating tangible, achievable goals for any given movement. John Molyneux highlighted that the working class-led Russian Revolution fought for bread, peace, and land, which was tangible things that people could sink their teeth into, rather than the intelligentsia-led French Revolution that fought for liberté, égalité, fraternité. This was a recent criticism by Amanda Seales of the No Kings rally on the 18th of October. Although one of the largest rallies in US history, it had no stated aims or goals. So what happens next, and how do we build upon that energy and that actual engagement? Having tangible aims can ensure the longevity of a movement, the number of people involved, and the success of actually achieving those goals. Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen found that a sweet spot for real societal change to take effect is around when 3.5% of any given population is active in a movement. In Canada, that would be 1.2 million people, all working towards a shared goal. But it's important for me to clarify here that a push towards mass activity is very important, and the chance for people to be involved and more engaged to fight for change is more important than striving for a magic number of success. So why does consciousness matter? Ensuring that we bring those who share common ground with us on matters is important to broaden consciousness and begin to see effective change. There are many different aspects of both ourselves and our lives that mean we can find common ground with people to create community and help to understand and change our deep-seated ideas and then begin to organize for a better future. We ultimately want to push the needle on the compass of action to the left. And as Leah Petty said in the podcast I mentioned earlier, only through mass activity can we move beyond a recognition of the inability of capitalism to function in the interest of the mass majority to a recognition of our own power as a class. That's me.
Thanks, Izzy. So now I'm going to be talking about where ideas come from. So a lot of ideas that people have about the world, around how it works, what's fair, what's not, etc., can greatly affect our consciousness and in many ways prevent us from having class consciousness and revolutionary consciousness. So those ideas include that capitalism and its inherent inequalities are natural and normal, or that life isn't fair and that's okay, or that economic security has to be earned when you work hard enough, or that socialism might be good on paper, but it doesn't work in practice, or it's too idealist. And there are also a lot of contradictory ideas and actions that are prevalent that also affect our consciousness, like how a lot of working class people tend to vote conservative and support billionaires and neoliberal austerity policies. So they're supporting the system that's keeping them oppressed and economically insecure, or having left-wing or progressive views and generally being critical of capitalism, but also being racist or sexist or homophobic, etc. So basically reinforcing oppression, even though all of these oppressive systems are intertwined. So capitalism needs patriarchy, white supremacy, and colonialism to operate. Or sort of the reverse of that, so being socially liberal but fiscally conservative, so claiming to support marginalized groups, but also supporting the systems that keep them marginalized. So all of that begs the question, where do these pro-capitalist and contradictory ideas come from? In short, it mainly comes from the ruling class. So the ruling class is not only a material force that dictates the distribution of resources, but it's also an intellectual force that dictates how we think about the world. And Marx talked about this when he said, those who control the physical means of production also control the mental means of production. And these ideas are also very hegemonic, which means that they're deeply ingrained in our ways of thinking. They're made to feel like common sense and something that's natural, to the point where thinking about alternative ideas, alternatives to capitalism, feels unrealistic. It might feel unnatural or too extreme or too radical. And that was theorized by Antonio Gramsci. So through institutions like the education system and the mainstream media, the ruling class convinces us that capitalism and its inequalities are natural and common sense. It's impossible to change. It's always been this way. Reduces inequalities to individual responsibility, so placing a lot of emphasis on financial literacy and getting a job, stop making excuses, for example, as a means to alleviate or prevent poverty. And then there's also the education system that works to manufacture the working class's obedience and compliance to the system, rather than critical thinking. So a lot of us are not really encouraged to think critically about the world until, let's say, for example, you start university, you take a social science class, and then that's your first exposure to critical ideas. But not everybody could afford to go to university. So a lot of these ways of thinking and opportunities to gain class and revolutionary consciousness are not very accessible to a lot of people. And there's also the lack of media literacy. So a lot of us are not really taught to critically examine the role of the mainstream media in shaping our views, or the fact that a lot of mainstream media outlets are owned by corporations. So news stories are often published and framed in ways that fit the dominant capitalist narrative and push ideas that favor the ruling class. So for example, the idea that immigrants are taking our jobs and housing are pushed on us to divide the working class and to distract us from the real problem, which is billionaires that are hoarding the resources and leaving the rest of us to complete for scraps. And then another issue that shapes our ideas, and more specifically pessimistic ideas about the state of the world and the idea that socialism or social justice is impossible or just really hard to attain, is the state's violent repression against resistance to injustice and rejection of ruling class ideas. So like, I'm sure we've all seen images of militarized cops terrorizing BLM and Occupy protests or homeless encampments. But then they were also completely useless and just standing around at the Freedom Convoy and the White House insurrection. And then in more recent cases, like we've seen ICE in the States kidnapping pro-Palestine academics for their views. So all of that works to discourage class and revolutionary consciousness, and it drives pessimistic views that nothing can be done about the injustice in the world. And the idea that capitalism and the state are just too powerful and we're too powerless, so why bother? The other issue is lack of access to information. So I feel like a lot of misinformation or disinformation seem to be more accessible than credible information based on evidence and scientific sources, which tends to drive right-wing ideas like anti-vax, transphobia, the idea of immigrants taking our jobs, which all contribute to the rise of fascism. So the accessibility of right-wing discourse became clear to me personally when I noticed that when vaccines were rolling out during COVID, there was a lot of anti-vax discourse, which seemed very accessible on social media and other parts of the internet, and promoted like fears of the vaccine and the idea that it's a way for the government, a way of the government controlling us, and other related right-wing conspiracy theories, which, if we're not careful, could lead people further down a rabbit hole of more right-wing beliefs to explain other social and economic issues revolving around blaming immigrants, blaming queer and trans people, blaming women, the woke left, which also tends to be exploited by right-wing politicians when, like in their speeches, when they misdirect anger towards these marginalized groups. And so all of that goes to show that simply being conscious of how messed up the world is and being personally affected by that does not guarantee revolutionary consciousness or a left-wing politics. Because like we see people gravitating towards right-wing fascism because those ideas are accessible and are presented in a way that resonates with a lot of people, that makes sense to a lot of people. And then another contributing factor is that a lot of people are too busy with work because living is getting more expensive while wages stagnate. And so a lot of people need to work longer hours and multiple jobs to survive. So many of us just don't have time to do our own research and to evaluate the credibility of sources and fact-checking and reading academic articles from Marxist philosophers and economists and vaccine science and all of that. So it is important that We meet people where they're at currently and make class and revolutionary consciousness raising ideas more accessible and feel less theoretical and overwhelming. So for example, we saw the popular protests like No Kings protest recently, or Don't Attack Iraq, or pro-Palestine demands for a ceasefire. All of these are very simple demands that are not inherently revolutionary, but it is where most people are currently. So we start from there, and then that's when we start to build capacity for class and revolutionary consciousness, which Octavio will speak more about next.
Thanks, Alaa. So how do ideas change? This was a challenging question for me to try to answer because I've experienced a lot of disillusionment and frustration in my own activism. Leah Petty argues that ideas can change through struggle, but even as someone in it, I still struggle sometimes to define what struggle means, especially to those who are not familiar with this concept. So in order to figure this out, I had to look back on my own experience and how my ideas have changed throughout. And I can confirm that changing ideas is indeed a struggle. So I grew up in a city on the border between Mexico and California on the Mexican side, where a lot of attitudes were very much influenced by American culture around individualism, upwards mobility, and wealth, while being apathetic at best towards any other alternatives. So I didn't really develop any sort of class consciousness until I was in my early 20s after moving to Toronto, when I began to connect with other people in the LGBTQ+ community, which is how I started learning about the political history of the community struggle, and also how I started getting involved in activism, one issue at a time. So I learned about other struggles which I didn't even realize at the time that also affected me, such as immigration, housing, gender, and labor, and how all these interact. Most recently, I have also joined the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And I swear this is like, I'm not just listing my activism resume, I'm trying to go somewhere with this. So as I developed class consciousness, I would try to share this knowledge and encourage my friends to join me at low-risk actions like marches. But I would only receive negatives. We were all on the same page in terms of things being bad, but taking action was a whole other story. And this was very frustrating to me because if things are bad, then why not do something? George Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist theorist, points to how capitalism commodifies everything and how this shapes how we experience and understand the world. Capitalism turns anything into a product: labor, experiences, even relationships. Simultaneously, as Alaa pointed out, the ruling class uses its power to shape education and information in order to keep the masses compliant while discouraging critical thinking. And in a dystopian twist, even an idea like revolution, which is so intrinsic to the struggle, has become stripped from its meaning, commodified, and turned into something to be consumed. Neoliberalism has redefined revolution as voting for the politicians who supposedly so will bring this change about. Thus, revolution becomes something that those empowered do for the masses, not something in which the masses can actively participate or have any agency in. And with the increase of state violence on a global scale, the idea of revolution has come up in a few of my conversations lately. Friends and acquaintances will say that we need revolution, and while this is true, most of them are people that have yet to get involved. Additionally, their understanding of revolution seems to be exclusively that of armed struggle like the French Revolution. But this alienates many people that have a lot to lose, and in doing so, it has also twisted the meaning of revolution into something that is inherently violent and intimidating. However, although revolutions can become violent, they're more of a series of gradual escalating tactics that can start with actions as small as volunteering, or a community garden, or a mutual aid network. But there is a silver lining here, though, and it's that ideas are indeed changing. People are realizing that something has to be done, but they're daunted because they are not aware that in the struggle there are many pathways to change. Many don't know where to start or what to expect. Leah Petty also mentions that for Marxists, consciousness stems from practice and the ability to comprehend that practice. But in order to develop any practice, first there has to be a willingness to try. I'd say that all of us have converged at this point at a socialist conference because there was a moment in our lives in which we recognized that things are fucked, that the system is unfair, and we decided to try and change it for the better. This standstill that people often experience when trying to figure out how to get involved reminds me of something I often encouraged growing up as an artsy kid, in which other kids and even adults would see my skill and tell me that they wish that I could also draw, or that they were talented. This is something that I still hear to this day as an occasionally artsy adult. I wasn't a master at 8 years old, and I'm still not a master by any stretch, but I became more skilled than my peers because I was passionate enough about it to want to get better at it. Now I tell people that they only need to put pen to paper and practice, but more often than not, they just shrug their shoulders. And speaking of art, the recent rise of AI art then becomes a great metaphor for the struggle of revolution. Because there is an art to revolution, but through commodification, capitalism treats both as products with zero regard for process. This warps people's ideas of how these things come to fruition. Just as some people want to be able to make a masterpiece on their first try, others expect a revolution from just attending one march, and then get frustrated when faced with the reality that that's not how things work. Many are quick to give up, while others are too intimidated to even start. The immediacy that modern technology provides has shifted attitudes towards the mere idea of trying. People are too afraid of making mistakes and failing. If the result of my effort is not perfect, then why should I bother when I can just upload it to someone or something else? There is a problem. This is a problem that extends beyond art. Whether it's school assignments, job recruitment, or even socializing, people are outsourcing thinking to these technologies in order to avoid trying. Effort is now regarded as an inconvenience when in reality it's the most important part of the process, mistakes included. Trying is how we learn, trying is how we grow. Trying leads to process, which in turn leads to action. Most importantly, trying is what the struggle is all about. So the question is not about how ideas change, but how struggle changes ideas. For starters, I found in my experience trying to mobilize those around me that people have to come to the struggle on their own. The circumstances that lead them to it will vary, but they have to want to try to change their conditions. We are currently witnessing an increase in movements and uprisings across the globe and on a local level in response to issues such as skyrocketing cost of living, worsening working conditions, state repression, and of course, multiple genocides taking place simultaneously. From marches to labor strikes to direct action, people who didn't necessarily have a class consciousness are now finding it and seeking to make their own contributions to the struggle. As activists, we can help shine a guiding light for when people eventually get there by remaining visible and welcoming. I find that even when people are hesitant to get involved, they become more confident when we have a consistent and vocal presence in the public sphere. As Izzy mentioned, it's important to have tangible goals that people can recognize. But we must also provide solid strategies that people can participate in depending on their skills and level of comfort. For example, here in Spring, we do a lot of postering on the streets, we do leafleting, fundraising, and we have a publication that our members contribute to. These may seem like small actions in the grander scheme of things, but we've been able to connect with people on a personal level by having direct conversations with anyone who approaches us while out and about. Another example, in my day job, I work at an art gallery where I was also part of a union drive which eventually led to ratification in 2022. Arts workers are one of the most overlooked sectors in the labor movement, but our drive had such clear demands that it led to colleagues in other institutions, like not just arts institutions, but also educational institutions in the city, reaching out to us, asking for guidance on how to start this process for themselves. I didn't know anyone in my neighborhood until I joined the University of Rosedale chapter of the Toronto for Palestine initiative, where I've met other people who are also learning not just about the struggle for Palestinian self-determination for the first time, but also about organizing strategies to hold our elected officials accountable and how to better support our neighbors. Just last week, the No Kings marches in the US saw hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, and many of these people attending are in varying degrees of the political spectrum, including those who voted for Trump but later became disillusioned. All of them went to signal that they want to change their conditions. There has been quite a bit of discourse surrounding the effectiveness of this march, but the fact that people are beginning to mobilize in such a scale is nothing to scoff at. Rather, it's an opportunity for those who already are in the struggle to find commonalities with these people and bring them on board. Ideas can also change when people see themselves reflected in the struggle. While this journey is starting for many, we have to keep in mind that there is still room for growth for those of us who are a little more seasoned in this. We haven't won yet, so we must maintain this practice of being open to to what new comrades bring to the table, as well as to new ways to meet the moment and become better organizers. 10 years ago, I was only dipping my toe in the pool of activism, and I didn't consider myself a socialist. If you had told me back then that I would be giving this presentation at this conference, I probably would have been stunned into silence. I've only been able to continue to do this work because my comrades have given space to my ideas, and my ideas have changed the more I learn from my comrades in the struggle. But the struggle is far from over, which means that there is still more to learn and there's more to try. Thank you.